Welcome to episode 8 of the Strategic Momentum Podcast. I'm your host, Connie Steele. In every episode, we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders and how they've been able to break through their business inertia and propel their business forward. Many companies are undertaking significant efforts to be digital in order to keep up with the ever-changing technology landscape and remain relevant to their customers. What it takes to successfully implement this so-called digital transformation, however, is not always well understood. Today's guest, Mike Renner, has more than 2 decades of experience leading organizations and driving real value from technology. As CEO of MPRE Digital, he works with companies to help accelerate their digital agenda. And in this podcast, he shares his perspective for what's needed to facilitate this digital transformation. Thanks for joining us on the show today, Mike.
Hey, good to be here, Connie.
So you've been in the technology space for your entire career and certainly seen quite a bit of changes. Tell us a bit more about your career journey and how that has led you to where you are today.
I will tell you, I got fascinated in computers when I was in high school, really deep kind of nerdy stuff around the technology. Got to college and ended up finding myself over in the business school and got an MIS degree because I was fascinated by the fact that there's a huge gap between all this interesting technology that was being created, but very limited opportunities where people were really thinking about how to leverage the value out of it. And so I moved on from there, got my first job, did a bunch of programming, and got hired into a startup. And the thing that appealed to me, and I learned right there, was the fascination I had was seeing all parts of the business come together to create value. My career has been in and out of both large companies and small startups. Some notable large companies I've been in I was in Thomson Financial Publishing back in 1993.
Wow.
You know, our job was to shake up the executive teams to tell them that publishing was not about ink, paper, and bindings. It was going to be digital and, a whole new model, new business models. Worked on the space station, a big old stodgy government contract, but it was fascinating to see how slow innovation occurs in some of those environments. So, I ended ultimately steering my career really into the startups. And I've had startups in application service provider business. Probably one of the biggest things that I've done, which is probably the largest chunk of time, has been we're building outsourced software product development using offshore. We started in 2004 and brought a model that was completely failing within the early stage companies into creating a lot of value for those organizations through altered methodologies and processes and bringing in agile before agile in a sense. So I've done a lot of very different things, but all in all, it's always been wanting to be able to make sure that everything was aligned within the business that I was working in to create value around technology. I'm very passionate about it because it requires a focus of all aspects of the business to address both the challenges and the opportunities that exist.
Given your company and that focus is to help them adapt and rethink their business to finally deliver value is certainly interesting. So let's dive more into digital transformation, that topic of digital transformation. It is still a pervasive buzzword that consultants commonly use, but what do you really think it means for businesses?
Nobody really knows what it is, but it sounds cool, and it gets everybody excited, and people seem to be making a lot of money around it, but it really isn't the nature or the essence of what's really happening here.
Definitely help people define it, because it seems for some very vague, and to be able to say, well, we are doing a digital transformation project sounds cool. It sounds like you're really moving the business forward, but my assumption is that they're not really sure what that really implies.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Connie. I like to try to define the whole digital transformation is really almost you almost have to turn 180 degrees. I think what people want to say or should be saying when they say digital transformation, they should be saying business transformation. Business transformation that is in response to the digital revolution. The introduction of digital, everything that we've experienced, in the last 15 years of technology development has crescendoed to create, a whole new technology base that is fundamentally shifting the core of our business, the core of our society in a way that we've never seen since the Industrial Revolution. So I like to get people focusing on the idea that what we have here is a digital revolution, and there has to be now a fundamental response to recognize what's happening and to ward off the threats and to seize the opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And this obviously has undeniably changed the game for every business, large and small. Some have been quick to adapt, others still struggle. In order to be relevant and competitive, it seems like all companies really have to go through this. There's no alternative but to make the shift. Why do you think they aren't?
There's a lot. I think one is we have a large education process that's still underway. That term digital transformation, because it's so ill-defined, has people still questioning what it really is. And two, we've got business leaders, who are non-technology based, that are struggling with what's happening to their business because they don't understand some of the fundamental connections of technology and the effects that it's having in markets and in human behaviors and social behaviors, buying patterns, expectations. There's a huge gap between their understanding the fundamentals of their business and having enough knowledge about what these technologies really mean. And so that gap of understanding right now has created one, either often lack of recognition. They're seeing it they're seeing issues in their financials, but they're not able to connect it to anything out in the real world. Two, fear. So the fear is really the fear of not understanding what's happening. They're seeing the symptoms in their business, but they're unable to connect that to direct cause. And so they're a little confused about where to go. And three, I think it has to do with some of the structural nature of our financial constructs that we've been operating in for the last 150 years. We have businesses that are focused on quarter-to-quarter performance. And that's been fine when you're sitting on a plateau, but the shift that we've got is global to the business. The business as a whole is now being pressured. They aren't in a position to feel free to make some of the investments that are necessary for fear of eroding short-term performance.
You and I have had conversations about how you think of the digital transformation and business transformation and how it relates back to the Industrial Revolution. I would love for you to share with the guests what are those analogies and how do you help convey some of those ideas and make it real for people? Because I'm sure what you've shared with me personally is what you've shared with some of your clients as well.
It is very interesting that if you go back to the Industrial Revolution and what it was all about, essentially it was about the technology introduction of mass production. And there were definitely, I think, about 5 key elements that, from a business perspective, that were at play. One is that it reordered value chains. To decompose that a little bit, up until that, we had cottage industries, and the garment industry was probably one of the first that was readily identifiable as completely disruptive. The idea that you went through and owned the entire integrated system of the wool to the fabric to actually creating the shirt to selling it, and it was all one unified entity. Well, now manufacturing came into play. We created breakages in that integrated chain. So now we had specialization starting to occur. And through specialization came optimization. So those poor people that didn't realize that their value chain was being broken apart were the ones that actually went out of business. They failed to adjust and find a place within their capability set, a defensible business position in a newly ordered value chain. The other one that came in is methods and process, where everything was in one room and may have been in one room and it went, one person did the same thing all the way through. Now we ended up with separated facilities, and the skills were being specialized into one person and focused on that optimization. Completely changed the process by which a shirt was actually produced at the end of the goal. Culture, corporate culture. How did employees relate to one another and communicate and integrate in the production of the end product? It changed greatly with the Industrial Revolution. The other thing that we also see, obviously, was the introduction of just the plant and the machinery that had to be created to leverage that technology, and that required building out new buildings and new structures of the facility. Probably one of the biggest things is that it was a period of time in which massive capital was deployed. And deployed with an expectation of returns, realizing that the period of time during which that return would occur might be, multiples of years, 3, 4, 5 years, but with the expectation that at the end point of that, market position and operating efficiencies would yield massive returns on that investment. It just took much longer to get there. And I see the same things happening right now. We've got this introduction of all this quote unquote digital technology. We see the disruptors like Uber and Airbnb who have taken this technology and just blowing up value chains.
I would say these 5 things that you had mentioned, the reordering of value chains, a difference in methods and process, a shift in corporate culture, investment in new infrastructure, and this expectation on also a capital return expectation. Do you feel like these 5 points that you brought up are still challenges and myths per se? Myths in that they haven't quite understood the right way to manage or tackle these 5 elements in implementing a digital transformation today? I
think there's a lack of really understanding of what's happening to them. And, I think that goes back to the conversations that are just starting to happen, that many business leaders think that there's a very small problem or a very small change. If there's any myth out there, the myth is that it was a technology-initiated problem or challenge, and it is specifically a technological solution to the problem. The type of disruption that we're seeing with this whole digital revolution requires really often a rethink of the entire business itself, starting with an analysis of, is my value chain being disrupted? Which ways is it being disrupted? Can I identify a place that I need to be in that value chain? And then the biggest and hardest question, and this is where the fear factor comes in, am I willing to cannibalize in order to move into that position that might be a safer position with the evolving new value chain, given the capabilities and assets that I have in my business?
With all of these challenges and barriers and gaps and perceptions, what do you feel it takes to create that strategic momentum for companies to really realize that business transformation? So how do they need to think about their business fundamentally differently? And what is the process to help get them going in the right direction?
And it's interesting, if you take a look at what's happening at the executive suite right now, I think there's 2 types of executives out there. And their behaviors is borne out through a pattern of operating that's gone on for 150 years. There's executives that may be getting ready to retire, and executive teams that have 3 to 5 years before they're really ready to go into retirement. They're reluctant to take on risk. They don't want their legacy at risk. And so they're the ones that are sitting on their hands and trying to stick their head in the sand and saying, well, maybe the storm will just, blow over or won't become too intense on my watch. and I don't want to really tackle this. And for those folks, it's hard for them to, or hard to move them to a position to say, no, you need to take action now. There's a new generation of executives that are coming into their roles that I think are much more aware of this. And unfortunately, they have some headwinds that relate to their boards, and they have headwinds related to our market expectations and our market dynamics. I mean, we work on a quarter-to-quarter basis of return. Some of the things that you need to do when you're cannibalizing your business or reorienting your business to safer havens to reap future rewards is that near-term performance sometimes becomes difficult to maintain. So there's fear in putting at risk near-term performance in order to position for longer-term gain. I think that the operating assumption of businesses needs to begin to shift from short-term to longer-term. I mean, I think people have missed the goal of why they are, where are they trying to get to? Just as the focus of the Industrial Revolution was reducing the incremental cost of a good produced, the response to the digital challenge and the digital revolution is to position to be in a position where you're reducing the incremental cost of detecting and responding to change. And there's a corresponding capital investment that needs to be made in order to make that type of a positional change, namely in your quote-unquote digital infrastructure, analogous to the manufacturing and plant equipment infrastructure that was a part of the Industrial Revolution. The fear is that I may not be able to quantify those ROIs within the degrees of certainty and time horizons that we have nominally been working under over the last 150 years, anywhere from 18 to 24 months. You may be looking at time horizons that are closer to 3 to 4 or 5 years. And
which can be very scary, I think, for a lot of executives, because there's a significant amount of investment that needs to be put in doing digital. You have other leaders within the organization who are pressured to show some performance. It becomes pretty stressful for them too.
Well, it is. It's a conundrum, and we've tried to create a culture that is risk averse and certainty driven, and that's what executives are being paid and incented to respond to. There's a challenge right even at that point that occurs up at the board level. Businesses value that quarter-to-quarter performance. Now, I will tell you, if you don't make those investments, you're going to start seeing that quarter-to-quarter performance begin to erode. But by that time, it's too late, because now you're talking about lag times of 2 to 3 years to get your house in order.
You've talked about these two kinds of executives. One, obviously, there's this concern of taking risk, given where they are in their position, and others who realize they need to take that risk. It's necessary to grow the business. In light of that, how then do you specifically move them through that process of understanding how to establish this transformation for their business to align to their long-term goals? How do you guide them accordingly?
I think one is about leading these executives through a process of I would say, awareness. And often that is getting them to look at each one of those 5 areas that we discussed before. Often you have to just take them one step at a time and tell them that the current step creates no obligation to take the next step. And so often it's just saying, hey, guys, look, forget if you're going to even execute on things, but let's just hypothetically go through this process and do an analysis of these 5 areas of your business, of impact, and especially the one about the value chain, and get real about both the potential threats that if first of all, identifying where you think there are shifts and disruptions occurring in those value chains, what are the threats and opportunities that they represent to the business. If you can get past that one, you can start now talking about hypothetically, what would it look like to go through a change? What would it look like of things that you would need to embark on to begin to either mitigate the threats or begin to position to take advantage and seize opportunity.
So really a detailed assessment.
It's really detailed assessment, but it really has to focus on finding enough of those drivers in that first analysis. What's happening in your value chain, and what are the technology, what's driving those changes, what are the threats, what are the opportunities, given an assessment of the assets that you have of your business today, and thinking out of the box around that, and trying to get enough comfort to actually even get that conversation started. Because if you've gotten that, now you've got a framework. Now you've got actually some tangible things to talk about, to start saying, all right, what's the value of doing this? What's the cost of doing this? What's the return? And how long does it take to get that done? Build the house block by block by block. And some people won't even get through that first exercise, and at that point they're done, because without that frame, the rest of the conversation is completely meaningless, because you can't assess any value.
Let's assume that you've made that progress, they've gone through this assessment, they realize where they need to make those changes in their value chain. Let's then talk about how you push this through the rest of the organization, which ties to culture. And culture ties to communication, it ties to integration. How do you then instill a shift in mindset, which then leads to ultimately a necessary shift in culture? That's a critical component to building that momentum.
I won't say it's a nebulous thing, but culture is one of those things. It can't necessarily just unilaterally be taught. It can't be decreed. It can't be forced upon. It's one of those things it's a byproduct of human behavior. Getting that culture in there is really part of executing on lots of little things. Once they've identified the fact that yes, we have to embark upon a business transformation. The first thing is some decomposition of, where do you start? I mean, the old adage is how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. And that's same true within this transformational framework. There's a lot of interdependencies, but you can usually start teasing out, 2 or 3 very specific things in the business that start you on the journey. Often it goes around customer-centric point of view. Customer should be having a very intimate 360 relationship with you, and that today's world, you need to get those aligned with how you're talking to your customer. We're in a content and informational revolution, and the customer is at the center, is now at the center. And the technology has provided us all these channels with which customers want to interact and receive and exchange value with us as a business. So often that's one of the first places that you go. How do I get the customer connected into every part of my business, and how am I leveraging digital channels and technologies to get customer insights, communicate with the customer, give the customer value in their interactions with me, etc. And it's not just your website anymore.
Having the perspective of their customers on an ongoing basis can help them realize that there's this need to shift. There's this need to evolve, because the way that they've been operating in the past isn't going to be the right way in the future, and that with all these different channels that are interconnected, that organizations can't work in silos in the way that they may have worked at before.
Well, it definitely starts to bring that corporate understanding that the activities that occur in silos are very connected in the eyes of the customer, and that does start to shift the culture. The goal or the result of the Industrial Revolution, the focus of it was, in a manufacturing sense, to reduce the incremental cost of goods sold. The goal of this whole business transformation, the technology revolution, digital revolution, and all this business transformation, the end goal and the end point of it is to reduce the incremental costs of detecting and responding to change. And I think at the end of the day, that's a point that has to be driven home in the executive suite. That, if you want to look at that parallel, you've got to translate that back into your business, because that ultimately is where you're going to hang and assess value of the changes the things you're going to invest in your business through this business transformation. And now you're starting to go back and saying, okay, how do I do that? So customer is at the centric. Customer insights are extremely important. Why? Because the rate of change that is happening in terms of behaviors of people and changes within the nature of the business environments that we work in, that rate of change is exponentially growing. And so the number of change pivots that you have to do as a business are immense, and they're continual. And so if the cost is too high at every time you change, you're not going to be competitive. And so so that drives back to culture. And one of the big culture changes that has to happen is instead of things being very top down, we're talking about agile businesses where management chains are actually reversing in a lot of sense to being bottom up. The ability and need to push decision making and operational accountability and directional accountability lower and lower in the organization, where the ear is closer to the evolutions of change, where you can respond faster, is really part of the mandate. That fundamentally is an envelope of culture, I think, that changes. Yes, senior management, executive management drives the envelope and direction of the business, but we have to build a workforce and a culture in our enterprises that teaches a sense of delegation through very clear accountability and responsibility and authority structures, and teach these individuals how to operate within some levels of autonomy, but also know how and when to manage upward. And that's a big change for a lot of organizations.
And let's even talk about one more point which you had brought up, having to do with infrastructure. We obviously have a lot of digital infrastructure where there needs to be investment there, because without that, you don't have a digital business. How do you get these organizations to understand the investment?
I would call it a business structural friction point that exists out there. And when you start tying it to that, what's the goal of this investment? It starts to make more sense. Many executives are afraid to even talk about the type of investment that needs to be there. So one of the ways that you work with that is just, identifying the concept, identifying the fact that, it's a long-term game. It is about protecting the business in the long term, but then you really have to start on a very incremental basis. Fortunately, there are some places where you can go and start making investments where you can get early returns on some of those investments up to a certain point. And we start breaking those, it's kind of like wading a child out into the ocean. It's okay. The ocean is not that big, bad place. We'll get your feet in, and we're going to get you up to your knees. And the waves get a little bit bigger, but you don't get completely knocked over. It really is an analogy of bringing people through that process. And then all of a sudden, out of that, you'll start to find champions, going back to cult, that finally get it. Hopefully you've grabbed a couple of key opinion leaders along the way, and they start to become some of those transformational agents within the organization. And this is something that happens over 24, 36 months.
Well, and what advice do you have for listeners to sustain that strategic momentum? You just touched upon it a little bit by the fact that once they understand the need to be agile, they've gotten their feet wet, they see this momentum, the test and learn dynamic is reaping benefits. You start to have champions who see it, and they become to share the gospel, so to speak, of this approach.
And you need a partner that understands and lives that reality, because a lot of what I just talked about is there is an element, a small percentage element that can be taught. But by and large, it's a behavior that is caught. And my approach in working with organizations to go through this transformation is to model it. and bring the clients, individuals who are part of that domain of whatever area that we're talking about, and actually set it up, operate it, model it, integrate them into that model so that they actually experience that. The key to that is getting the executive sponsorship to allow that to happen. Mm-hmm. But if you do have that, it is amazing to see what happens. It's a little scary from at first, but the satisfaction that comes with operating in that model, it's amazing to watch the energy level and commitment levels of those individuals begin to increase, and that starts to become contagious. The myth of long-term planning, founded on the idea that I want predictability. There's an antithetical thing that happens, is that within the agile sense, if it's properly implemented, you can create a norm that is actually more predictable, with a more predictable set of expectations that lead to the results that you want. One is they're starting to get an organization that's identifying, detecting, and responding to the change, which should result in more predictable business performance, which at the end of the day is what you really want. Mm-hmm. And as you start to move the needle on that, you start to see the momentum begin to build within the enterprise to take on, other areas and integrate other areas of the business through this transformational process.
Great. And then what other advice would you have for companies to have them look at this as a marathon versus really a sprint?
Well, if you think about a marathon, involves pacing. It also involves segmentation. When you're a marathoner, you break it up into segments, and you have strategies for each segment of your race. And so, I think you have to look at the end game, look within each segment. What am I investing in? Part of what I'm doing in that segment is investing in the future that I'm not going to see necessarily a near-term return, but there are things that I want to invest in that are going to give me near-term returns to buffer that whole performance issue.
A lot of great perspective for anybody who is looking to do a digital business transformation. I think this hopefully gives you some really good insight into steps as to how you need to think about implementing it in your organization. Taking on a digital transformation effort really involves a business transformation. It entails a detailed assessment of your value chain and identifying where those opportunities lie. Yet implementing this takes time. Success doesn't happen overnight, and so you can't evaluate it as such. It's continuous because change doesn't end. And at the end of the day, the end goal of a digital transformation is to reduce the incremental cost of detecting and responding to change. Because when you can identify and respond quickly, you can ultimately create predictability. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. You can connect with Mike on LinkedIn or via email at michael.renner@mpredigital.com. That's michael.renner@mpredigital.com. If you want to hear previous episodes or even get show notes from this episode, visit us on our podcast page at flywheelassociates.com/podcast. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.